This is level one of the CFA program, the topic on portfolio management. And by the way, this is the portfolio management part two and the reading on basics of portfolio planning and construction. You might remember that in that very first reading of portfolio management one, which was called something like an overview, I introduced the concept of this investment policy statement. I might even have used the words that the IPS is the pulse or the heart and soul of the relationship between the financial analyst and the client. And in that reading, we kind of danced around some of the elements of a policy statement. But here in this reading, we're really going to dive into it. And I would prefer this to be called not really the basics of portfolio planning and construction, but the meat and potatoes of portfolio planning and construction. And you'll see what I mean when we look at these LOSs. All right, reasons for writing the policy statement, describe the major components. So that second LOS, that's probably the most important LOS in all of the 18 or 19 study sessions that are in level one. Risk and return objectives, willingness and ability to take risk. And I've talked to you at length about willingness and ability to take risk in other recordings. And today we'll see exactly what that means. And then we'll talk about the constraints, asset classes, construction, and then at the very end, we'll spend a few moments on environmental, social, and governance considerations. Now, I will say this, I'm super proud of those of you who watched and paid attention to Risk and Return Part 1 and Risk and Return Part 2, the two previous readings in that last study session, because they were super long, and you probably were challenged to pay attention for over an hour in both of those. This one here is relatively short, so we should be able to get through this one pretty quickly. However, I can't emphasize enough the importance of the policy statement. And let me go ahead and remind you that all the stuff that we did in that portfolio management part one, risk and return, all that stuff gets thrown in to the policy statement. And so, of course, you need to know how to throw it in properly and accurately and in its correct spot. All right, so this is what I tell my students all the time. The policy statement is super important because it is a written document. And this written document outlines the contract, outlines the agreement between the client and the financial analyst. And so what it has inside of this document are things that benefit both the client and the analyst. So why is it necessary? Well, some countries have a legal and binding agreement that the relationship between those two parties must be legal, right? So legal regulatory requirements, governance arrangements. This is interesting here. The example that the reading uses about pension managers. Remember that a pension manager, may or may not work for the employer, but the pension manager has to make decisions for the beneficiary, which are the retired workers and the potential or someday retired workers. And then suitability of an investment. Notice the words that we chose there, and this is from the reading as well, outlines the client's needs and preferences. So this is what I said to you back in that earlier reading, that when a client comes into our office, whether it's an individual or an institution, we need to make sure that we get to know from a financial standpoint everything that client hopes to achieve during his or her or its lifetime if it's an institution, and then what are the fears. And that's really the way I summarize a policy statement, hopes and fears. Now, of course, the Institute doesn't use that kind of terminology. They use the terminology like risk and expected return. All right, continuing along my thought process about how this benefits both parties. So for the client, it identifies, and what's probably even as equally important as identifying is also quantifying return, quantifying risk. And so the big benefit for the client is that, this document is going to summarize the objectives and the constraints. And then, of course, once we get to know our clients, then we're going to be able to say something like, oh, I see you have a little baby there in the carriage. Let's worry about things like, hey, how are you going to pay for their education? That's 18 or so years from now. Let's start thinking about that now. And let's make sure that we're prepared for it. I love this third arrow point. I emphasize this to my students all the time. This should be an educational experience. How many times, and I'm guessing that you guys run through this in your life all the time, that there are so many people out there that have very little knowledge of investments and the way the New York Stock Exchange works and time value of money and all that stuff. And so as a good academic, I love the role of being an educator for clients. And I'm of the opinion that most people out there, they have the capacity to understand. They might not have the willingness, but they have the capacity to understand about their life and about their life's financial position. Let me give you just a quick example here. I'm a voracious reader, and I'm in the middle of the Peter Frampton biography. And I was sad to learn that in the 1980s, Peter Frampton was broke. I mean, here's a guy that had the greatest and the most popular selling rock and roll album of all time, should be a multi-millionaire. And I think, boy, if Peter Frampton would have just visited with someone who holds the CFA designation in 1978, he would probably be richer than the Beatles today. So think of Peter Frampton. Think of how the clients need to be educated. And, some need to be educated this much and some need to be educated that much. And how about some benefits for us, for the advisor or the manager? And so, of course, we need to get to know the client. This is guidance for decision making, because when you sit with a client, you get to know their hopes and their fears. And so it's important to, kind of link those together and be prepared for delinking and decoupling so that there are ways to manage the disputes. You've heard me say this before. It's so important to identify the risks, to quantify the risk, and then manage the risk. And inside of the management of these risks, there needs to be a guideline for the resolution of disputes. And then sometimes you have this document and the client will come to us and say, oh, I was hoping for all this stuff, but all this stuff didn't happen. And you can go back to this document and say, oh, well, remember what we were thinking back a year ago? We were thinking all these things, and that's why we made these decisions. And of course, there's risk, and we can't be perfect predictors of the future. And so this is why we did it. And so that links back to the educational experience. I call your attention, those of you who are sports fans, especially golf fans, you'll watch a golf tournament and there will be commercials for, wealth advisors. And so, what's the theme of all of these commercials? The theme is, oh, come to us, let us have your money because we care about you and we're going to help you achieve all of your financial goals. All right, major components of the IPS. Now, let me go ahead and give you the assignment that I give my undergraduate and graduate investment students. I have them write a 1 to 2 page creation of a fictional client. Now, of course, when you have a client that comes into your office, you'll have to ask them a series of questions. So description of the client, dependents, wealth, age, job security, assets, all that kind of good stuff. Purpose of the IPS. So the statement of purpose, I'm going to go ahead and simplify this right here. The purpose of the IPS is so that we can document our relationship. I oftentimes tease my wife about this. I really didn't want to have a marital contract before we got married, but I would love to have had, excuse me, I would love to have had an investment policy statement before we could have gotten married, because then that purpose would be, hey, the purpose of this IPS is for us to figure out our financial position all the way through. It's been 30 some years of our marriage. And so that's really the purpose of an IPS, is just to figure out the financial position of the client and then where that financial position is going to be tomorrow, maybe not tomorrow, but next month and next year and next decade. Duties, of course, we need to figure out, all right, I'm going to be responsible as the wealth manager for this and this and this, but you need to be responsible for making certain that I have your tax returns at the end of the year, that I know exactly how much income you're having, if you have parents for an inheritance or any kind of stuff like that. Steps for updating the IPS, that makes perfect sense. So here's really this the meat and potatoes. So the investment objective. So there's a risk objective and there's a return objective. And of course, those have to be linked, and we'll see that in a couple of slides. Investment constraints. The CFA Institute is of the opinion that there are 5 constraints. You'll see that as we go through. I have my students do a 6th constraint, which is a behavioral constraint, but the Institute just kind of throws that behavioral constraint into one that's called unique circumstances. We also have to concern ourselves with what the client is comfortable investing in. I mean, as we know from all of our study sessions here in level 1, is that there are tons and tons of investment opportunities out there. Of course, there's the traditional equity investments and fixed income investments, but we also know there are alternatives. We know there are emerging markets. We know that there's all sorts of stuff out there. So we need to figure out what's appropriate. And then remember I said that third component, what did I say? Identify, quantify, and manage. And part of the managing of this is to evaluate the performance. How are we going to decide if I'm doing an acceptable job? We need to make those rules ahead of time. There's nothing worse than changing the rules in the middle of the game or at the end of the game. And then in the appendix, we can throw all sorts of stuff out there. You know, one of our goals, and we'll see this here in just a few minutes, is to come up with some type of an asset allocation. The Institute calls this strategic asset allocation, which is for the long term, and then how we're going to rebalance to get back to that strategic asset allocation. And then somewhere in the middle, we might have some tactical decisions that we're going to make. All right, how about risk and return objectives? And I'm guessing that you know this from our discussion on return. They can be absolute, that something sounds like, hey, I'm going to be here for 20 more years of work life, and what I want to do is I want to beat inflation, I want to beat the S&P 500, I want to have at least a 4% return so that I can send my children to education, to finance their college education. So the return objectives, they can be absolute or relative. And the same thing with the risk objectives. They can say something like, you know what, the S&P 500 index has this much risk. We accept this much risk. And so we have to decide, oh my gosh, aren't we so happy that we went through all that stuff with risk and return, in particular risk? Are we going to measure risk by standard deviation? Are we going to measure risk by beta? Are we going to measure risk by value at risk? You know, there's an absolute measure. Or are we going to do it some other way? So this is a really great exam question. You could have a risk objective, just a sentence in the question stem, and then the Institute would ask you, hey, is this absolute or relative? And, you know, they do a really clever job of asking these questions. Remember, you only have 3 choices. And so, you know, a lot of times in the practice problems at the end of the reading, they'll have 3 columns. And so you have to pick which of the column is most accurate or least accurate. And maybe 1 or 2 of them are absolute and 1 or 2 of them are relative. And you got to figure out the difference between those 2. How might these risk and return objectives be developed for a client? Well, you just sit down and you ask a whole bunch of questions. So notice we have in parentheses or in bolded there, substantial fact finding. And look at the second teardrop point, you know, client circumstances discussing objectives and requirements. What did I do? I summarized this just a few moments ago by saying, what are your hopes and what are your fears? And then, of course, good record keeping is important. Let's move on to this super important concept of the difference between willingness and ability to take risk. And you'll have to distinguish between these two on the policy statement. We'll have an ability to take risk, and this depends on things like, and I'll just go ahead and summarize it with one or two words, the wealth of the client and the age of the client. All right, so notice what we have there. Longer investment horizon, greater assets versus liabilities. A secure job means, more income, and then more insurance against adverse, unexpected events. These things all lead to higher levels of the ability to take risk. And so these are pretty easy to come up with. All you do is, when you interview your client, you say, A, how old are you? And then B, how much money do you have in the bank? And that's, when my father was alive, that's what he always asked me. He was always worried about our financial position. He always said, how much money do you have in the bank? And I would say, you know what, Dad, I don't have hardly any money in the bank like you think of in the bank, but I have a bunch of other stuff out there. Now, willingness to take risks, this is a completely different animal. And this has everything to do with the specific investor's risk aversion. That's why we have that in bold there at the bottom. Let me remind you of the conversation we had back in, I think it was in that very last study session under Risk and Return Part 2, in which we drew the efficient frontier. Let me go ahead and draw that for you. Remember, there was the Harry Markowitz curve, and then we drew these indifference curves. And remember, I said to you, some investors have steeply sloped indifference curves. Those are investors that have high levels of risk aversion, and some have very flat indifference curves. And so essentially, and this is really not much advice for me to give you here for the exam, essentially what we have to do as good wealth managers is to find the slope of the indifference curve for each one of our investors. And so imagine sitting with a couple who's 50 years old, and they have 3 or 4 children, and you ask them the question, hey, what is the slope of your indifference curve? They're going to say, you know what, we're going somewhere else because we have no idea what you're talking about. So it's our job to ask unique questions so that we can identify the willingness of the client to take risk. Here are some sample questions. And here's one that's not on this list, but I say this to my students all the time because I think this is a great question. Suppose that you're at the boardwalk and they have this ride on the boardwalk where they have these 2 big poles and they have a rubber band in the middle and the seat. And what they do is they put you in the seat and they take you all the way back and then they let you go and they shoot you out over the ocean and somehow they catch you and bring you back. Would you go on that ride? And if you say yes, well, then that person is probably somebody who has lots of willingness to take risk. I wouldn't even get anywhere near that ride, so there's no way that I'm getting on that thing. All right, so what are some, probably a little bit more reasonable or better identifiable questions here? Let me just read these quickly to you. I would say I take more risk in relation to the average person. I'm willing to risk a percentage of my income. That's a good one. To achieve high returns, it is necessary to choose high-risk investments. Okay, so you get the sense here that this questionnaire is going to give us a viewpoint into the client's ability to sit in the rubber band and be thrown out over the ocean. I guess that's called fun. I guess you would have to be 20 years old to do that. As a nearly 61-year-old man, I would never do that. Of course, I wouldn't have done that when I was 20. This is almost identical to an exam question that I come up with my students, and clearly this shows up at level 1, level 2, and level 3, where you have a client, and the client has some conditions. And so here's a client, 35 years old, hopes to work for, a whole bunch of years, married, has a 4-year-old daughter. All right, so here's the first thing. As you're reading this question stem, 35-year-old engineer, married with a 4-year-old daughter. How many 35-year-old engineers only have one child. So you need, as you're reading this question stem, you need to start thinking, okay, we need to pay for this daughter's college education. If she wants to go to a college, we need to figure out how to pay for her wedding if she decides to get married. And then what if we have, a son and another daughter and another son and then, and then a dog, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the plan. And so I always tell students, when the client comes in, your first goal is to draw a timeline for the client. So today's time period 0. So there's a big X marked out there at time period 65 on retirement date. This 4-year-old daughter, year 18, she may go to college, and then let's just pick 25. She might get married. Let's pick 26. She goes off of our health insurance. Let's pick 28 when she's independent, and then we have her little brothers and little sisters. All right. So notice that, boy, what do we have there? There are 3 sentences in this question stem, but they could lead to an entire paragraph. Now, I will say this, that in level 1, it probably is limited to this 3 sentences, but in level 3, it's going to be an entire page. All right, so notice what we're given here in the question stem. We've got a salary. We have ownership of some assets. We have investable assets. Okay, savings amounting to $200,000 in bank account. Think of that as an investable assets. Reasonably secure job. Well-versed in financial matters. Okay, so that's important. So here's a relatively educated client. Confident the equity market will generate positive return over the coming years. Oh, I'm going to scratch my head and say, okay, I don't have any idea what that means. Confident that equity markets. Now, you guys are, how old are you guys? 25, 35 years old. During your lifetime, you've pretty much had rising stock markets, but there's been the recession in the George Bush years. There's a recession in the early President Obama years. And there was COVID, and there was the inflation of 2022. So we have to ask ourselves the question, all right, we're 35 years old today. We're going to retire. So that's one part of the whole thing. And we're going to say something like, okay, we wouldn't be here as good financial analysts if we didn't believe that the equity markets weren't going to rise over the next 30-year period. Okay. Hopes. There's that word hope. Most of his savings will be used to fund his retirement. Strongly agrees with the question, I would be willing to risk. All right, so the question then becomes, what about willingness versus ability? So I want to go over to the orange first, because I always think this is the easier of the two, ability. So high income, boy, that sounds like he has a high ability to take risk. Secure job, substantial assets, long-term time horizon. And so what the Institute might say is something like, hey, let's pick between high ability to take risk, moderate ability to take risk, low ability to take risk. I would put this client here up in the high ability to take risk. All right. So then let's go over to risk, the willingness to take risks. This is way different because we can almost use some mathematics over there for ability, but we can't use much math over here. We have to take a step back. And this is more of the artistry. I tell students all the time, and I know I've said this in previous recordings, that to be a good wealth manager, you need to be both a scientist and an artist. So the science part over there in the orange is, kind of math. And the artistry, can you take the broad brush and can you paint a masterpiece? Good knowledge about financial markets, answers in the questionnaire suggest probably a high risk tolerance, maybe moderate to high. I don't know if the Institute would ask you to do that. Probably high. So here's an example where this client, David, probably has a linkage between the ability to take risk and the willingness to take risk. Now, of course, when I create exam questions for my students, I'll have some parts of the question stem where the client will have a high ability to take risk and then a low willingness to take risk. So then what do? There's a conflict between these two. You can't just flip a coin and say, oh, ability wins out. And I'll give you the example. I've said this before in previous recordings. When my father was alive, especially after my mother passed away, he was so worried about his portfolio. And whenever his portfolio, he would get a monthly invoice, not an invoice, a monthly result from my cousin. Actually, my cousin managed my dad's money. And whenever his portfolio would fall, he'd pick up the phone and call me, and he'd start yelling at me. This would be my fault. How could this possibly be happening? And I would look at my dad and I would say, dude, look, if you're too upset about this, then you need to restructure your portfolio, which of course my cousin did as a good wealth manager. And so by the time my dad was 80 years old, he had very conservative investments. And when he got his monthly statement, if it was the same amount, he was happy. If it went up, he was thrilled to death. So this is just an example of swinging back to what I said earlier about the educational process. And so if you have a client who has lots of ability to take risk and maybe low willingness to take risks, then you could probably nudge that willingness up a little bit, but it has to happen through the education process. And by the way, my father was a stubborn old dude, and it took my cousin some time to convince him of that. And my cousin was way more patient with my dad than I was, and he really did an awesome job of helping my dad. And there are some good examples down there. Notice the bottom one, best interests of the beneficiaries. This is super important, and the Institute will probably test you on your ability to say something like, all right, we have this thing over here, whatever that thing is over here, but you're managing this fund, managing this capital for a beneficiary, which may or may not have a strong relationship with, maybe the plan sponsor or the family or whoever it is. Best interests of the beneficiaries. Remember that. All right, how about these 5 constraints? So I can't imagine an exam that doesn't have a question on at least one of these, if not all 5 of these. Now, notice the top left, unique circumstances, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute, but I want to clarify what I said a few moments ago. I always have my students do 6 constraints. One of them is a behavioral constraint because I spend probably a week talking about all the behavioral issues out there. And students really like hearing about cognitive errors and emotional biases. So in this client description that I have them fictionally create, I require them to come up with a client that has 1 cognitive error and 1 emotional bias. So I have that as a separate constraint, but that would probably be thrown into the unique circumstances constraint in the CFA's viewpoint. So skip over to the far right, liquidity. So this is a super important one. Let's go back to that client who had a 4-year-old daughter. Let's suppose the client says, look, when my daughter turns 18, I want to have $100,000 for her to go to college. Is that a liquidity constraint? Probably not, because that's 14 years away. But if she was 17 years old and she was going to college a year from now, you'd probably want to take $100,000 out of the portfolio and put it into, let's say, treasury bills or maybe a 1-year CD or something like that, something super low risk, so that you have that $100,000 when she goes to college. I mean, how painful would it be if a year from now, she comes to us and says, hey, I'm ready to go to college. Where's my money? And we would have to say, oh, I had it invested all in a non-diversified portfolio. I had 2 stocks and we had a pandemic and the stock price fell by 90%. Sorry, but you can't go to college. Of course, this is all part of the educational process. Time horizon. This is important here. It's not too emphasized here at level 1, but it's super emphasized in level 3. Always divide the time horizon into stages, regardless of the age of the client. And I want to say that in almost every circumstance. But clearly for our 35-year-old engineer, we could have multiple stages, right? He's 35, maybe we want to say a 20-year time horizon would be one where we can do all sorts of crazy things because this client has high willingness and high ability. But then once the client turns 55 and gets within a decade of retirement, we might want to adjust that portfolio to maybe some extra fixed income. So maybe we have a 20-year continuous time period, and then maybe a decade pre-retirement, and then early retirement. When people are 65 or 67, they want to do things like travel, and they want to take their grandkids to Ireland to play golf, or they want to do all sorts of stuff. So we want to have early retirement where they're active retirement, where they're probably going to have liquidity needs. And then we get to later retirement and estate planning. So easily we could have 4 stages in that 35-year-old engineer. Tax concerns, this is super important, and the Institute emphasizes this at all 3 levels. The easiest thing to say is that this 35-year-old client, he probably makes a lot of money, we were told, and so what does he want? He probably doesn't want high dividend paying stocks because they're taxed at, are they taxed at ordinary income, capital gains? Who knows what the politicians are doing these days. And then some clients have legal and regulatory factors. So let's go ahead and go through these in just a little bit more detail. So liquidity constraint, this has 2 elements to it. The ability to turn investment assets into spendable cash. So there is a liquidity constraint if the client's daughter was 17 and she needed $100,000 a year from now to go to college. But lots of clients have liquidity constraints that may or may not be as dramatic and as timely as that retirement for college education. Take, for example, wanting to buy a lake house or a beach house. And the client might say, you know what, I want to buy a beach house in 5 to 10 years. Well, this is probably not a liquidity requirement. But if the client says, hey, I'm going to do this in 6 months, well, we don't want to invest, let's suppose it's $1 million lake house. We don't want to invest $1 million in high risk equity securities over that 1-year period, because we don't want to come to the client and say, oh, you can only buy a $600,000 house because we lost 40% over this past year. Oh, that darn stock market. We don't want to have to say that. So just take out the $1 million, put it in Treasury securities. So notice what that second block point does. It says something like, quickly converted to cash when that obligation needs to be met. So you'll have to read through the question stem and decide, is this a liquidity constraint? I would love to be able to tell you to use the kind of accounting framework of saying, liquidity, cash outflow, a one-time lump sum cash outflow, 1 year or less. That's probably not a bad way to think about it, but some clients might have a liquidity event that's a little bit longer than 1 year. Could be 2 years, probably not 5 years, but as this 4-year-old daughter gets closer and closer to her college days, you might want to start taking portions out of that. But of course, this is the combination of the science and the artistry that is required of all of us. So that's the first part of the liquidity constraint. The other part of it is, what are we doing with these investable assets? So let's consider investing in some illiquid investments like a hedge fund or a private equity fund. Clearly, if our daughter is, what was she, 4? Let's suppose we invest in a hedge fund, and this particular hedge fund says, hey, you can't have your money for 20 years. Well, we probably don't want to invest that portion of her college fund into that hedge fund because we don't have access to it until she probably graduates from college. And so liquidity has to do with a one-time lump sum cash outflow within a relatively short time period. That's one element. And then what's the liquidity of the investments that we make on behalf of the client? Time horizon, this is what I was saying earlier. Of course, time horizons are almost long-term. I remember reading an example years ago, and I use this to kind of fake out my students. I'll say something like, suppose you have a client who is wheeled into your office on a gurney, with IVs strapped to his or her arms, with an oxygen mask and 10 doctors around there. And the client, removes his or her mask and says, I have $1 million. I want you to invest it. I'm only going to live for 10 or 15 minutes. And I say to my students, what's the time horizon on that? And they were like, short term. And I'm like, no. you have to ask the client, all right, what happens to your money in 10 or 15 minutes? And the client says, oh, I've got 6 grandchildren. They're all under 10 years old. So then you have to, boy, what did that earlier slide say? Manage for the beneficiaries. Tax concerns. Boy, we need to concern ourselves with not only federal taxes, but local taxes. We need to make sure we know which interest on fixed income securities is taxable at which levels, whether dividends are taxable at capital gains or ordinary income, what kind of investment in preferred stock are we going to use, what do we do if we have a stock split or a stock dividend. And so what's the goal? The goal is always to consider tax implications to do things like meet the client's risk and return objectives. Legal and regulatory factors. I mean, there are some absolutely legal ones that say something like, if you're a mutual fund, you cannot invest in swap contracts. That's part of the prospectus, so that probably has something to do with SEC rules and laws. But it could also be contractual. This is an example I give my students all the time. I say, suppose you have the CEO of Coca-Cola Company come to you as a client, and within the employee contract that it reads something like, our CEO is not allowed to invest in PepsiCo, right? You can't invest in any kind of our competitors out there. And so this is it's a contractual constraint. So even if you think that Pepsi is a much better stock than Coca-Cola, well, this particular client is precluded from making that investment. And then unique circumstances. And so this is the way the Institute looks at this constraint. It's anything that doesn't fit into those initial 4 constraints, you can throw into this kind of a market basket of unique circumstances. And so what do we have listed here? Religious preferences, ESG. We'll talk about that at the end of this slide deck. I'll just give you a personal example, one in which I'm not really quite sure how I feel about it. My mother passed away from lung cancer, but I don't know if I have an aversion to investing in tobacco stocks. I might, but I don't know that I do. But some clients might have a very strong preference against tobacco stocks or gaming stocks or beer stocks or wine stocks or anything, right? Here we are in the 2020s, and there's a tremendous emphasis on social justice. And so we need to, there will be lots of clients out there who are very concerned about this. All right, let's go back in time. Let's get in our time machine and go back to 1952. This is when Harry Markowitz drew the efficient frontier for us. Now, of course, he did it just with some really super slick calculus. But essentially what came out of the efficient frontier are optimal weights that we can invest in each asset class or each individual sector or even each individual security. And so what the Institute has done is they've taken the Harry Markowitz output and called this strategic asset allocation. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say something like, all right, look, that 35-year-old engineer that we talked about a few moments ago, you need to have, let's say, 3% of your investable assets in a money market mutual fund in which you have a debit card and you have access to this thing all the time. Now, you're not going to use this to go to the food store, but you'll use it if you want to pay your, let's say your annual property taxes or something like that. So 3% in a money market mutual fund, 80% in an equity fund, and then what does that leave? 70% into, let's say some kind of a balanced fixed income fund. So those are the strategic asset allocation weights. Strategic meaning, hey, this is long term. We're comfortable saying that when you retire in 30 years, that this SAA will help us achieve your goal. Now, of course, this 35-year-old engineer was self-described as, pretty well versed in financial language and terminology. And so what we might want to do for this client is show the client the correlation matrix. Oh my gosh, this would be so cool. It is so cool talking to clients who know a little bit about correlations and betas. Then you can show them all kinds of really, really cool stuff. And we know that last arrow point down at the bottom. I'm not even going to read it to you because you know, if you paid attention to my previous recordings, you know all about correlations. Now, here's where we get specifically to the asset allocation output from Harry Markowitz. Notice we have the help of a computer program to craft the efficient frontier. And I teach my students how to do this. Let me just give you a quick rundown. We go to Yahoo Finance, we download daily stock prices for, 10 or 15 stocks. We download them into an Excel program. We convert those to returns. We put together the variance covariance matrix, and then we use Solver to draw the efficient frontier. And it's really simple and it's really cool. And my students have an appreciation for being able to replicate a Nobel Prize winning work. And so that's what the second arrow point tells us. We're going to come up with the optimal portfolio and those strategic asset allocation outputs that result from those computer programs. Now, I will say this, the reading doesn't emphasize what I'm going to say here, but this makes perfect sense to me. We might have a strategic asset allocation. What did I say for that 35-year-old engineer? 80% in equities. But what we might want to do is we might want to put a range on that. We might want to say 75 to 85%. What that does is it gives us a little, what do some people call that? The wiggle room to change that strategic allocation so that we can tactically take advantage of some of a really hard-earned work that we've done in identifying under and overvalued sectors so that we can overweight or underweight and still be consistent with that strategic asset allocation. Notice what we have at the very bottom, perceived short-term opportunities. Now, the question then becomes, how wide of a range do you want? Do you want 75 to 85%, or do you want 65 to 95%, or do you want 0 to 100%? When I have my students do this, I say, look, I give you some leeway here, but if you put 0 to 100%, I'm going to take off points because clearly a strategic asset allocation weights from range from 0 to 100% is not too helpful. So this is a good slide to summarize what I was telling you. So we want to underweight some stocks because we like the crude oil industry. We might want to overweight some stocks. This is called active portfolio management. And so notice what we said earlier, that as part of the portfolio construction process, we need to monitor and evaluate our performance. So the monitoring component is exactly this tactical asset allocation. And by the way, we'll have to ask the client the following question. We'll have to say something like, hey, if I find an opportunity, do I need to call you first or can I just jump right in? What if you're on the lake swimming and I can't get a hold of you and I really need this? And we really need this. All right, how about these ESG? And let me go ahead and editorialize here. This is not part of the reading, although there is a paragraph inside of the reading that does say something like, you know what, these are all good things, but we need to do, kind of a marginal cost, marginal benefit estimate. So you'll have some clients who are going to be super concerned about maybe the environment, maybe social issues, maybe governance issues for individual corporations, or they might be super sensitive to all three of them. And so we're required to craft a policy statement to meet their risk and return objectives. On the other hand, we'll have clients who really don't care about any of this kind of stuff. And so as part of the familiarization of the client's hopes and fears, you'll probably get a sense of where they feel about all this kind of stuff. So you can have negative and positive screening about this. I like this third this third arrow point, ESG integration. I think this is really where the future of this goes, that we do a marginal cost, marginal benefit analysis, which, whether this is good news or bad news, this has to be made in some consideration of the politics and the political movement and the politicians who are in charge of the government, because what we know is that the government can force allocation of capital into directions that may or may not ultimately have the highest payoff. And so that ESG integration, this is where I personally, this is just my personal opinion, this is probably where the future holds, where the future lies. Marginal costs, marginal benefits. I tell my students all the time, and I've said this in recordings, you should be reading the Wall Street Journal every day. And this is this fourth arrow point, engagement and active ownership. We read about active investors out there who want to have seats on the board of directors. They want to make certain that they're investing in companies that are sensitive, that are appropriately and properly sensitive to these ESG considerations. And so that's the engagement, active ownership, impact investing, and thematic investing. Those are obvious notions. Now, this is what I was saying in that earlier slide, driving the integration. This is why I think is important. And this comes right out of the reading as well. This is really not my personal opinion here. You know, we've got to figure out the scarcity of natural resources. I know since, I was in grade school or high school, we've had this concept of peak oil. We've hit the peak oil and we're going to be declining in the supply of oil as we move forward. Well, of course, this wasn't true in 78, and wasn't true in 1998, and still not true. And so, we have these really smart men and women who are engineers who are figuring out how to get stuff out of the ground. And so this applies not just to oil, but to gold and to copper and to, what do we call those things? The rare earth metals that we keep reading about. So that's important for us. And I mention this just because, the Institute, they don't want us to be experts in all of this stuff. I mean, they want us to be experts in the policy statement, but they're not requiring us to be estate lawyers. They're not requiring us to be tax accountants. They're not requiring us to be environmental specialists, but they're requiring us to have a basic fundamental knowledge of this so that we can lead our clients into their optimal portfolios. And the same is true with climate change. The same is true with trends, both demographically and economically, trends in social justice, the rise of social media. I've said this before. I'm not on social media. I don't have any interest in being on social media. Maybe some people would claim that I'm on social media because some of these videos are on YouTube, but I'm happy to do this just to impart some of my knowledge so that perhaps you can have a better chance of passing these exams. But also, you notice I try to give in all of my recordings, some kind of life lessons that I learned. All right, so what are we trying to do? If we're passive investors, then, pretty much this strips away lots and lots of stuff that we're talking about. But lots of us and lots of clients want to be active investors. So in order for us to beat our benchmark, we need to decide what is the appropriate benchmark. Is it the S&P 500 index, or is it some broad economic index that includes these ESG factors? And that takes us through the LOSs. I'm going to go ahead and repeat that second one there. Describe the major components of an IPS. This one is, in my mind, the super important one for level 1, level 2, and level 3. I'll go ahead and just end with, I can't emphasize enough how important your knowledge of the policy statement is, and your ability to take every other reading out there and ask yourself the question, where does this fit into the policy statement? And I promise you it fits somewhere into that policy statement. So I hope you guys have a great day. I hope you've enjoyed this one here. I had fun making it. Good luck studying.